it's my hope that, because throughout the book, throughout my experiences, what I've done is sort of given voice to the words that I never said out loud. And so my hope is that as people read this book, they will look at themselves and say, why am I not asking this out loud? There's a quality that I think we've lost in that. And so I've always felt this sort of innate desire to coach on feminine leadership and what that means, right? And that doesn't mean that it's absent of the masculine. It means that there's a balance, and I think everybody's balance is different.
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Welcome, I'm Yanik, your host, and now joining me, Chanchal Garg. Chanchal Garg is a speaker and executive coach. She's also the founder of Real Space. She also has one of the most popular elective courses at the Stanford Graduate Business School. And I'm so happy now to really welcome her to the show to discuss her incredible story, her book, Unearthed, the lies we carry and the truths they bury, and her life in general. So if you are up to learn something more, something deep, something that really helps you to connect with you and others, and so much more, stay tuned. Welcome, Chanchal Garg, to the show. It's such an honor to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Yanik. It's a pleasure.
First, to start with, give us a taste who you are in simply one powerful sentence.
That's a great question. I have been described, and I would experience myself as compassionately fierce and fiercely compassionate in terms of just my essence. In terms of what I do in the world, I'm an executive coach, I'm a facilitator, and the author of Unearthed, The Lies We Carry and the Truths They Bury.
This is such an exciting title, and before we dive into the book, I really want you to unpack and give us some context how it was like to grow up in a pretty conservative religious family, and really to lay out a little bit the pros and the cons and how it really ultimately shaped to some extent your trajectory.
Sure. So, yeah, I was born and raised in the US. So it was it didn't always feel in alignment to be raised in a very conservative, traditional Indian Hindu household, right? So my parents were very, very traditional, very cultural in the way they raised me. I often say they raised me as if we were living in 1970s India, right? And so there was a constant sort of battle within me, I would say, about whether or not I'm Indian enough or if I'm able to fit in the Western culture and the American culture enough. And so there was always this sort of um, sort of struggle within me, honestly, around how to do that. And oftentimes it seemed as if someone else was sort of choosing for me in terms of how I needed to be. Because as a child, you don't always get those choices, right? So in terms of the things I was allowed to do, the things that I was shamed for doing or that I wasn't allowed to do. And I tell a lot of these stories in my book just around, for instance, as a child, I used to love to perform on stage, whether it was drama or choir or things like that. And my father, being a very traditional Indian man, did not want his daughter on stage. And so that was always sort of a challenge between us. So it was a lot of just trying to figure out who am I and how do I become myself in a world where there are so many expectations and often conflicting expectations.
That is so interesting. And I really invite you to unpack this a little bit more because it's sometimes hard to relate, right? I grew up in a culture where, you know, more or less everyone really looked, as I look, roughly
Sure.
speaking. So it's very different. So it's really hard to put yourself into kind of this situation. I hear it a lot from my friends of color, right? But
Mhm.
unpack this a little bit, what this actually means and still really means. And I think for generally speaking, for people who might not necessarily look the same and don't really feel like they fit in, was it by and large an issue and a big challenge when you were in your adolescence, or was it more when you were a little child? So how did
Yeah,
it play out, and how did it go once you reached adulthood?
sure. So, again, because my parents raised me so traditionally Indian, I wasn't one of those kids who was trying to run away from my culture. A lot of times I hear people of color, or especially immigrants, when they're born and raised here, they tend to run away from their culture as a child and try to sort of integrate into a more American culture. And that wasn't who I was. I was very, very proud of my Indian roots. And at the same time, there were ways in which I was trying to sort of acclimate into the American culture. Oftentimes, I found that my friends, I was very fortunate that I had many friends who accepted that. And then there were some who sort of broke off the friendship because they just didn't understand me. For instance, I remember once and this was more in adolescence. So you asked, like when I was younger, I don't think it really impacted me as much. But as I started to get older into adolescence, I remember a friend of mine invited me to a sleepover once, and my parents were not, they, that was not something that was allowed in our household. Right. And so I remember her inviting me, and then the next day, and again, I write about this in the book, where she just sort of broke off the friendship. She said, I don't understand you. And I think a lot of that had to do with me not being able to hang out outside of school. Right. And so there was those kinds of relationships as well. But a lot of my friendships, they were very accepting and, accommodating to that. So, as I tried to bring all of me, as I like to say, right, to my relationships, it worked in some places and it didn't work in others. I think my parents, in order to experience loyalty from me in their eyes, needed for me to be all Indian, right, and not American at all, and that was challenging, right? So it is hard, and I think when you are battling those sorts of expectations, at least for me, I started to lose sight of who I really was. It got to a point where I didn't know what I wanted anymore. And as a young adult, I didn't really know what I wanted. It was always me sort of scanning the room to see, what does everybody else need, and me gauging my own safety, even based on how other people in the room were feeling. So I didn't really know myself until I started to recognize that these expectations were harming me and I really needed to find myself.
Now, you had a very interesting childhood, as you said, that your parents were really basically more or less hovering over you. Really, they had really good intention, I think,
Of
as
course.
most of our parents have, right? I think it's really important, and ultimately, it shows what you have achieved, right? I mean, you are today here. You're such a bold woman who goes and does the things that she really love to do, right? And so it's it's inspiring what you're doing. So but I just want to quickly go back and how to actually find out and what you actually wanted to do when you were a child. What was it, first and foremost, that you actually wanted to do? You said, of course, you didn't really know because it was more defined by your parents, right? Because they
Mm,
basically set the path, right? Which
right.
is in one way or another very reasonable because they simply know better than we when we are a kid, right? So just unpack a little bit some of the things you alluded to it. So you love to sing, you love to do theater and so on and so forth. And what else where you kind of somehow limited in what you were able to do?
Well, just in terms of having friends, right? Or just being with, having a social life outside of school. My father was someone who, if I had a friend, then they, in his eyes, they were somebody to be aware of, right? Like you had to be careful because he didn't want outside influence. And so, for whatever reason, my father's upbringing, whatever, he was always a little too cautious, in my opinion, right, around who was around me. And so that was very challenging. I think, as a child, I don't know that I always knew what I wanted to do, but I really, really enjoyed performing. I really enjoyed singing, dancing, doing all of those things. There was a point where I wanted to open my own dance school, right, for a while for children, but that wasn't something that was going to be acceptable in my family, right? And so I went on, I got my MBA, I got a master's in healthcare administration. Um, I don't know that I necessarily knew what I wanted to do then. I ended up having a job in healthcare finance, which was not the place I needed to be. And thankfully, just through sort of the trajectory of life, I got recruited into a healthcare think tank where I started to work on leadership development. And from there, sort of started my journey in leadership development, coaching, facilitation, all of that, which today I love to do.
That sounds wonderful. I just want to, I know we are a little bit off track, but I'm just curious about the culture because to me, the US is a really good example of really attracting all these incredible talents, which ultimately makes it the country that just produces like the most insane things. Right now we have reusable rockets and just it's amazing. And this, of course, by and large, you can make the argument because parents like you, they came in, right? They raised you in a certain way. Therefore, the output in terms of your schooling, your intellectual ability, your drive provided ultimately the country, the United States of America, with these incredible people who make these incredible people up, right? So, how do you see that? Because once you don't have that anymore and you have only, let's say, because of course you see where I'm getting at, it's about also finding somehow a balance, right?
Mhm.
And so we can go from one extreme to the other, and so it's always tricky. And we
Yeah,
see this also in the political discourse everywhere, right? And life
right.
is really a balancing act. But I'm curious what you think about that, just the importance of having those kind of people who make up the country.
Yeah, well, I think it's extremely important that diversity allows us to think in different ways, right? So for instance, as a child, if I would have only lived in my own Indian culture, which is a very collectivist culture, which is a very beautiful thing, right, in many aspects, but it also did not allow me to have a sense of self, right, because it is so collectivist and it's almost overdone in many ways. And so coming to the United States and being exposed to different ways of being, sort of a more individualistic way of being, I was able to incorporate some of that. And honestly, I attribute my boldness and what I'm doing in the world to that. And so I think, we can't look at it as one way or the other, right? Like you're saying, it attracts so many differences to the United States. And I think that is so important because there's no one way that is correct. We need to find the right mix for each person, I think is different, right? And so for me, like I said, I needed the collectivist mentality, but I also needed an individual identity in order to be able to survive. And so I think in the United States right now, if we look around, it's very individualistic, almost too much so. And so I think when you have these other cultures coming in that bring more of a collectivist view, it allows for more community. It allows for more um, compassion. It allows for more empathy. And so I think, like you're saying, the United States, in my opinion, is great because of its diversity, because of all of these different cultures that it has brought in. It used to be described as a melting pot, and I'm not sure if that's the direction we're going in now, which is a little sad.
Thank you so much for sharing this. So I just want to go back a little bit really to the book and really to unpack your story because it's very emotional. And so therefore I think we have to be very clear, and I thank you for being so honest because it is, you make yourself also very much vulnerable. So w- was there a moment where you decided you gotta get this out there, you gotta make yourself vulnerable in order to somehow free yourself? And what was the reason, what was the moment? Describe when you had this impulse that you gotta change something, you gotta get it done, you gotta write about it and also share it in order to uplift really people.
Yeah. I don't know that it was necessarily one powerful moment. I think it was a series of events that happened. For me, when I first started writing, it wasn't because I wanted to publish a book. I didn't want to, put it out into the world. I started writing for my own healing. And just for your listeners who maybe have not read the book, Unearthed, The Lies We Carry and the Truths They Bury is my memoir about what happens when powerful people betray your trust, right? So it's about my journey through spiritual and sexual abuse. And a lot of it is the healing journey from that. And so, what about 5 years, I would say, after I separated myself from the community that had caused me a lot of harm, I started writing, and my primary focus was for my own healing and for my children. So right now I have a 13-year-old daughter and a 16-year-old son. And when I look at my lineage, my maternal lineage in particular, I see a line of women who were not even able to acknowledge their own existence, and they were silent. And I didn't want that for either of my children. I wanted my children to, number one, know my story, and I wanted them to be able to continue to evolve our lineage, our culture, and all of that. And there's sort of a myth that silence equals loyalty, right? Like if we don't talk about these things, then that means we're actually being loyal to our culture. And I want to break that myth because I actually believe speaking about it helps us to evolve it. And so that was my primary reason. Then on the other side of this, I'm also an executive coach, a facilitator, and a lot of women of color, daughters of immigrants, tend to be attracted to my work. And so as I was working with all of these women and at the same time sort of writing, I started to notice that the same sort of unconscious narratives that I needed to overcome in my own healing of such extreme circumstances were the same narratives that these women were having to overcome in their day-to-day life in leadership. And so and nobody, and it almost seemed as if it was shameful in a way that we were having to overcome these narratives. And so I didn't want that to stay in silence. I wanted to put my story, I decided to put my story out there. So, number one, women didn't feel alone in what they were experiencing. People could realize that these narratives are not to be taken lightly. Like, they might be sort of hidden in your everyday life, or they can result in sort of the atrocities that happened in my life, which is what I expose in my memoir. And so I really wanted that to be a bridge between my leadership work and me as a person to understand why I do the work I do, and also to help the women recognize that they're not alone in their own stories.
What gave you the strength to really talk about your sexual abuse, really, what you had to go through?
So I don't know that it was anything external. I had to find that power from within me. When I left this community, there was no support. My parents didn't really know what was going on. My husband was not there to support me. I was alone. And so I had to walk away from this alone. And I remember when I threw the pictures of my abuser away and I left that scene, I remember telling myself, you have everything you need inside of you. And I didn't believe it at first. And all of the tools, all of the coping tools, all of the um, sort of things that I relied on up till that point had been given to me by this spiritual teacher who had been abusing me. And so I had no tools. to rely on. I didn't want to go back to any of that, right? And in many ways, I sort of walked away from my culture for several years because I had felt betrayed by it. And so I had to rely on myself. I had to find the strength within me. I had to know that I had to walk my own path. I often say that in those days, my companions were rage and grief. Um, and those aren't things that people want to be around. And so it's sort of, in many ways, I would say it isolated me even more. But I had to walk that path alone. I really did. I had to walk it alone. I had to recognize that it's, I need to stop looking for strength and power externally and recognize that I have it within me. And so when I did that, and then I had my own children, the biggest thing that I took on when I had my children was that it is my responsibility to protect them. That's the job of a parent. And so from that perspective, I mean, just that responsibility alone, you might even say, gave me the strength to write. And then when I looked at these women and I looked at my own life and I said, I don't want my life to be just something that happened, right? I want to be able to turn it into purpose. And so I guess you could say that was the drive that gave me the strength to talk about it. And it was a lot of
Incredible.
healing along the way. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight for sure.
Incredible. I mean, it must be an incredible journey, just, with rage and grief. And it almost seems like what really young, says that our problems are really our, our, fool, basically, what helps us grow in our consciousness, but it's really, really tough. I mean, I don't say this lightly. So I'm just curious about how did your parents especially react and your husband? So how did this somehow play out, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah. So do you mean when the book came out?
Just in general, when you decided you gotta walk away.
Right. Right. So I write about this extensively in the book. At first, my mother, I don't think she understood when I first told her that this had been happening for the past 10 years. Her first response was, I'm not mad at him. Right. And so I didn't really, I didn't really know how to take that at first. When I look back on that moment, I wish I would have been angry at her, but I wasn't. I think I was just frozen. When I told my dad, he didn't understand. I want to say like maybe 6 months later, he finally got it. So, the pictures of my abusers stayed up in their house for another 6 months, unfortunately. Um, and then it took me another 2 years to actually tell my husband that this had been going on because we were married even as this abuse was happening. And when I finally told him, he felt that I had sort of cheated on him or that I was disloyal to him because of this abuse. And so that was very hard, right? So again, you can imagine it wasn't just that I didn't have support, it was almost as if my trauma was sort of um, being used against me in many ways. And so, it was a long process. And with my husband, we've gone through so many ups and downs. And I'm grateful today that we have a much better relationship. He's in support of my work, in support of this book that has gone out into the world. He read it before it went out into the world. Um, and so it's just been a really long process. And with my parents today, um, I have learned that we're not going to see eye to eye. And that's okay. Like we can have our differences. And today we have a relationship because I want them to be able to have a relationship with my children. But there are a lot of boundaries. There are a lot of restrictions. There's not the closeness that I would have liked. But I think at some point, at least for me, I had to realize that there's only a certain amount of capacity to understand within each person, right? And everybody is actually doing the best that they can. And so to understand that and just have a relationship in a way that works, understanding that there are differences, we don't see the world the same, is okay. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm also thankful to our culture for that because I think in many ways the Western culture would just say, well, separate. You can, write people off. And I don't know that that's something that our culture does in many ways. And so I'm grateful that we've been able to have differences, but still sort of stay connected as family.
it's also outstanding to hear that you're still together. You're still together with your husband, and I can imagine the burden it put on the relationship to really go through. And of course, this is an ongoing work, and that you put this out there and you share this is incredible, because again, right, it's not, you know, in the sense only you, right? Of course you went through, there is no, you didn't do anything wrong, right? But at the same time, you also know that the more you share, the more people become also vulnerable, right? And
Mhm.
especially as a man, right? So how do you approach this whole situation, and what kind of advice would you give if someone finds him or her in such a situation, because it's such a crooked situation? There are almost non perfect solutions. It's just what really life is. There's so much gray in between, and to just
Mhm.
to navigate this space, it's so hard. So what are some of the steps that you think, and especially also given the fact that you are a facilitator,
Mhm.
to navigate this crazy situation?
Well, I think first, I mean, my editing process alone was almost 9 months, right? And so, um, that process was a lot of like, what do I want to put out there, and what's the perspective that I want to take. And so, in my work at Stanford, there's this concept called the net, right? And this idea of staying on your side of the net, meaning staying in your own experience, not moving into someone else's experience as you are in conversation, or in my case, as I'm telling this story. And so it was really a lot of questioning myself, like what parts of my story are mine to tell and what parts are not my story to tell. And so it was really a lot of that discernment around what to include, what to not include, and also make sure that I'm portraying people as human beings, right? Because human beings are flawed. There's no one who's perfect, and there's no one who's um, an absolute demon. I might argue that there is one person in my book that I did demonize, but I think that was probably deserved. Um, but beyond that, I tried to make sure that everyone was portrayed as a human being. So there's, like I said, there are attributes and there are flaws. And so it was a lot of that questioning, and there was a lot of grappling that I went through during that process. I didn't want to portray anyone as less than human, in my story. So that was one. In terms of how to navigate it, I think it's a lot of our own healing, right? Because when you go through something like this, at least for me, one of the hardest things for me to recognize was that it wasn't about forgiving my abuser. It wasn't about forgiving my parents. It wasn't about forgiving my husband. It wasn't about any of that. It was about me forgiving myself for allowing myself to be in that situation, for allowing myself to be in these relationships in this way, for allowing other people to treat me this way, right? And so once I'm able to forgive myself for that and recognize that I did the best I can and have a lot of compassion for myself, then that compassion can naturally start to extend out in a very boundaried way. I want to add, because I don't think it's necessarily, it's not something that you want to be overly um what's the word? I'm trying to find the word. I don't know. You don't want to give too much, right? When you've been in that sort of situation, boundaries are very important. So I just want to emphasize that, right? Um, but I think there's a way to navigate it by really recognizing what is mine and what is not. And so that's been my exploration. And honestly, the whole book and my message is what are the narratives that are ours and what are the narratives that are not? What are the narratives that have been fed to us, whether it's by culture, parents, lineage, family, organization, school, society, culture, community, whatever it is. But there are so many things that we believe to just be true, or that this is just how I am, when really it's not. It's just who we've been fed to be. And so unpacking all that and saying, okay, is this really who I am? Is the process. And I would say it was the process of writing the book too, just in terms of, is this my story or is this not?
there are so many layers, and we will really go through it with limiting beliefs, authentic connection, and so on. But I still have some question in terms of relation, but also in terms of how come that oftentimes victims feel guilty,
Hmm.
even though it's so obvious that you are not.
Right.
What is your perspective on that, and how kind of to stop this negative process, because it really leads to some extent even really self-destruction. So walk us through your take on that, because it's huge. You hear this over and over.
Yeah. Well, I think it's unfortunate, but that is something that I think is society's work to do. I think as individuals, we have to recognize that just because society has a perspective does not necessarily mean that we have to take that on. But the implications of being abused, especially as a woman, are usually that you did something wrong. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You brought it on, all of this. So, I mean, the narratives, it's the water we're swimming in, right? The water that we're swimming in says that if you were abused, then you did something wrong, right? And so it's very hard to not internalize that. I would say the other piece of this is that, when I was editing my book, I was working with several editors. And I remember one editor in particular, one day she called me and she said, you keep dancing around this R word. When are you going to use it? And I said, what do you mean? And she's like, well, when are you going to call rape rape? Because I kept calling it a betrayal. And the thing is that the word rape tends to insinuate like a lot of aggression, someone pinning you down. It's got to be like a fight almost. But oftentimes that's not how it happens, right? People use their power to make you believe that you're doing what you want to do. And so when you look at that, it's so covert in so many ways. And then when you're the victim of that, you're looking at yourself and you're like, wait a minute, nobody forced me to do anything. How is this rape? Of course, like, what is wrong with me that I allowed myself to be in that situation? Right. So it's very insidious, and it's a very hard thing to unpack and really start to question yourself and really start to look at the power dynamics of the situation and recognize what happened. And none of us wants to feel like we're weak enough to be brainwashed, right? But honestly, anyone who thinks that they are not susceptible to being brainwashed needs to be careful, because we're all susceptible to it at some point, right? And so I think a lot of those things are contribute to victims feeling guilty for their own abuse, right? And then you layer that on to, it depends on the support that they get, right? Like for me, when I came out with all of this, there was no support, right? So I had to navigate that myself. Even years after I was going through this, I don't think I still realized how much guilt I felt. And so it's been layered. It's like layer upon layer upon layer. I'm still in therapy today, right? And there's constantly new layers that are being excavated. Another example, one of the questions that people often ask is like, well, why didn't you just say something, right? When it happened, why didn't you just say something? And it was about 2.5 years into writing my book, right? So we're talking, gosh, maybe 20 years later after this first incident, right? So about 2.5 years into writing my book, I remembered that, wait a minute, I actually did try to say something. I didn't remember up until that point. So you can imagine, like, there's so many things psychologically that we repress, we suppress, we don't want to think about it. It's painful, right? So, I mean, I don't think it's one answer. There's so many things that contribute to this guilt that survivors feel um, when they're in situations like this, and it does. It involves so much work. It's about unpacking these narratives. It's about really looking at the power dynamics of a situation. And again, it doesn't happen overnight. And some of um, these wounds are so deep that some people never get the chance to to heal, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for sharing. And of course, you know, myself as well, you know, you can't really put yourself into this situation. It just, there's no way. But when I remember, you know, occasionally you have those kind of situations where obviously it's not sexual abuse or whatever, but there are situations, right, where you just kind of feel you can't really say something, or it's just so powerful, right, around wherever you are, or the person that
Yeah.
is actually in charge. So it, it really makes sense, but it also, it's easy, of course, to say and to blame it on the victim, right?
Mm.
What I was also thinking is that there is also an aspect, and I'm curious what you think about that, is that oftentimes, if we look first and foremost within ourselves and somehow it gives us control, I think it's almost like a psychological mechanism that we somehow feel empowered, even though we are completely disempowered, and even though we know it's not our fault, we have been victimized, we have been raped, or whatever it is. Nonetheless, we somehow want to take back the control. The illusion of control is actually a thing because it is empowering, right? And Alan Langrose does a lot of work of that, which really means that, look, we know that we can't control everything, but if we think we actually can, it's to some extent empowering. So, how does this fit in with your example? Because I find your example is just incredible what you have done with all this. You speak about that, you make yourself so vulnerable, and at the same time you have so much at stake, right? You have two children, you know, you have a husband. And so please unpack that and how it also ties into limiting beliefs, because that's something that you started to teach as a coach, right, to
Mhm.
people. So how does this all somehow fit together? So control, limiting beliefs, and really your story.
So there's a story that I tell at the end of my book about a full force self defense class that I took. So in this class, people get dressed up and they get fully padded, right? So that if even if you like really kick them hard or punch them hard, they don't get hurt. And I took this class, and in the class, they reenacted the the moment where this so-called spiritual teacher assaulted me for the first time. And this is like, you know, I mean, this was only a year and a half ago that I did this training. So it's not that long ago. And the the padded person, they came in and they said to me, you know, because it was the day that this assault happened was the night before my first marriage. And so they said to me, you know, I was talking to this, you know, quote unquote guru, and I said, you know, I'm really nervous about getting married. And they said, oh, you know, don't worry, that's normal to feel. Why don't you lie down? Okay. Now this is only a year and a half ago that this reenactment is happening. I was about to lie down. I was about to lie down. And this is like not that long ago. And then slowly it was almost like a flip switched in my mind. And I was like, nope, not going to do that. And that voice, like within me and like even externally, started to get louder and louder and louder until I said, there's no way. And I got in, you know, this padded person's face and I was able to actually defend myself. And I punched and kicked him until no end, right? But I bring this up because in order to get my power back, I had to go back to that moment and find where I lost it, right? I had to go back to that moment where I felt powerless and regain the power in my own body. It's an embodiment, it's not a mindset. And so, and I don't think, you know, it's almost hard to trust your own growth after it happens. It's like it's there in your body, but you don't, it's hard to even know that it existed. And so after that incident in the training, I almost look back at myself. I'm like, how could I have been so ready to lay down? But then I realized, no, I had to go back to that moment and reclaim my power, right? So I'm saying this because you're asking, how do I feel empowered enough when I'm making myself so vulnerable to put this story out there when there's so much at risk? So for me, yes, is it vulnerable? Yes. But for me, vulnerability is strength. Vulnerability is not weakness. My vulnerability is going to be my children's strength. They now know what happened. They now know what to look out for. They now know that it is okay to have a family, be in community, and also have a sense of self. They know that it is okay to respect your culture and also speak up when you're not comfortable. They have enough trust in themselves to believe when their body is saying this is not okay, right? So all of these things are empowering for me. Yes, it's hard sometimes to tell these stories, but over time, it does feel like my greatest power. And in many ways, like this was, if you read the story, and I get this a lot, people say, like, I cannot believe that you went through all that. There are people who've known me for years and years and years. And the book came out, they read it, they're like, oh my God, I had no idea. I had no idea you were going through all of that. Yes, that's true. But that's not why I wrote it. I wrote it so that we could all find those stories that we tell ourselves that are not true. I wrote it for that reason. I'm not saying it's complete. Healing is never complete, but I've done a lot of the healing, right? I've done a lot of that. So the other thing I would say to people who, maybe have gone through something like this or something similar, don't go through it and say, okay, I'm going to put my story out there right away, because you're putting yourself at risk. That's not wise. Do your healing work first, right? And that doesn't happen overnight. You've got to do that work. Otherwise, you're putting yourself at risk to be re-traumatized, right? And even after the healing, it's still hard. The day the book came out, I didn't want to get out of bed, right? I don't want to paint it as all easy because I've done the work either. It's still hard, but I have to remember my purpose. I have to remember why I'm doing it. And from that perspective, it is very empowering.
How has your life changed in terms of your purpose and meaning since the publication of your book?
So I don't know that it's changed since the publication of my book. Um, I've always, since I started my own coaching practice, have always really wanted to focus on women and women's leadership. What I see today in the world is that women in leadership positions, there's not a lot of great models out there, and so a lot of times women in leadership try to behave like men, right? And then they're called, bad bosses or bad bitches or whatever. And there's a quality that I think we've lost in that. And so I've always felt this sort of innate desire to coach on feminine leadership and what that means, right? And that doesn't mean that it's absent of the masculine. It means that there's a balance, and I think everybody's balance is different. And I'm not talking about gender. I'm talking about um, energies, right? Like if you think about the yin and the yang, there's yin and yang in everything. And in every human being, there is feminine and masculine, just to different degrees, right? And so I'm just saying, what are we leaning on more of? Where are we out of balance? And so I think that purpose has always been there. And then as I started to write my story, there's been more of a focus on that. So I don't know that my purpose has necessarily changed. I definitely didn't write this to start to work with victims of sexual assault or anything like that. It's really more of like, these are things that are actually pretty common, and like you were saying before, when we were talking about sort of blaming the victim, I think society and culture tends to look at people who have experienced this as not good enough. Oh, you must have been one of those kinds of people, or you must have done this, and that's why that happened to you. Like I said, I'm an educated woman. I've got a double master's degree. I've got a family and 2 children, a thriving business, um, and I've been through this. So it doesn't just happen to, quote unquote, those kinds of people, right? And so I think there was a desire to show that as well.
Brilliant. I'm just curious about masculine and feminine energy. And what you're really talking about is, again, it is Young who said, actually, and I want to have your take on that, just by reflecting on your own experience. So, what he said is basically that the woman, for example, at their early stages, they're obviously very feminine, right? But the older they get, the more masculine energy, you know, takes over, especially midlife onwards. And when it comes to men, it's just the opposite. And it's actually very interesting to read that, because I can tell, especially people in their 60s, 70s, I can really see those kind of things that oftentimes, and of course there are many reasons for it possibly, but what do you think? Is there kind of those kind of stages of life where first we might have more the feminine energy in terms of who we are, in terms of our sex, and then gradually it changes over time? What is your take on that?
I don't know that I have a very generalized take on that because I see a lot of variation, right? Like I see a lot of young girls who are very masculine. I see a lot of young boys who are very feminine. And, so I think I see it across the board. I think that for me, the important thing to remember is that, it's not set. We're not just feminine and we're not just masculine, right? We have both of those things inside of us. And if we can recognize that, then we can actually choose how do we want to show up in the world. And, I think there's also a bit of a narrative out there that actual femininity is weakness, right? And I don't know that that's true at all. I think there's, again, if you look at complete masculinity, what in terms of like, strong energy or aggression or dominance or all of that, if you only have that, you can imagine. I mean, you can look at the world and see where we are today, right? So you need more of that balance. And I think when we lose that, especially as women, um, it's a liability.
So true. I'm just actually curious about what you just said, because it's true. There's a lot of men, more and more, but there are many, many reasons, of course. But it's also something that actually Carl Jung said. The question is if people have ideas, or if ideas have us. In other words, it's actually also a Hindu saying who says, it's Arvind Sharma who said that. It's one of the greatest comparatives, in the field of religion, and he's also Hindu, and he said, and I find it so powerful because it's basically what Young said, but just put it differently within a more Hindu context. He said, you have to ask yourself, does the desire have you, or do you have desires?
Mm-hmm.
So so that is something I want to know. So how do you think, like, how it plays out? Because it's very, very strong, like different cultures. And then again, as you said, right, it's about the balance. And then at some point, we have sometimes a hard time to find kind of this balance. But the question really is, how do we find balance? How do you find this balance within you, that you can tap into the masculine energy, but also at the same time take advantage of your feminine
Yeah.
energy?
For me, it's awareness. It's a constant excavation. I don't know that there's anything that leads me to any sort of permanent balance or perfection. Um, it's just constantly asking myself, how do I want to show up and why? Why do I want to show up that way? Right? Is it because I have a fear of being taken seriously? Is it because I feel that if I show up as more feminine, I'm not going to be taken seriously or I'm not going to be considered credible? What are the reasons behind it and are they true? And so it's a constant awareness, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And then beyond that, like from my own story, from my own book, I've sort of taken these three pillars that I like to teach about: identity, language, and embodiment. And identity, I define as the sum of our lived experience, right? So it's a sum of our lived experience, but then again, it's choice. How do we want to choose to show up? And so again, like finding that choice, you asked, how do you find that balance? For me, it's not even a balance because I think at any given time, you're going to lean one way or the other. And so it's really a matter of being in choice rather than allowing the unconscious to always be what's running the show. And that's challenging, right? As human beings, I don't think we can be um, fully conscious 100% of the time, right? That's almost exhausting. But it's about, trying to get a little bit more conscious, I think, every day.
You seem to be the perfect CEO or boss. I would love to work under you. Just
Well,
the
thank
impression.
you.
I think you're super confident. You really know what you're talking about, and I think you just have a super feeling too. And you really how to build a vision, how to direct people so that they make the best choices possible. What would it be like to work, for example, under your leadership? So describe a little bit your take on leadership, embodiment, identity, and language, and how you embody it on a day-to-day basis. Because of course you're a mother, that's already a CEO, but you are also a CEO of your own company. You're a coach of CEOs. So give us a taste what it is like really to work under your outstanding, without doubt, leadership.
Well, I appreciate that. So I can tell you a little bit about these three pillars. So I think the one thing that I like to think about most is that when you're running an organization, yes, you're running a mission, but you're working with people. And so when you forget that and you lose the humanity within an organization, you're no longer working with people, you're working with robots. And that can be dangerous. So, going back to identity, again, identity is the sum of your lived experience. It's about choice. It's not a static thing, right? So, as a leader, I think that's important to recognize within yourself that you are constantly evolving. And it's important to also recognize in your people, they are constantly evolving. And how are you supporting that evolution? How are you not making sure that they get boxed in one place? How are you making sure that they can expand their own identities as they move through your company or through their careers, even? Right? So that's one way identity can play out as a leader. From a language perspective, how are you expressing your own identity? And this goes down to your tone in an email, to how you're showing up in an all hands meeting, to how you're showing up in your one on ones. Again, are you encouraging? Are you inclusive? Are you recognizing that not everyone has sort of this same benchmark for what is okay and what is not? Not everybody understands the same norms that maybe you do, and you're setting the culture, right? So if there's a culture within an organization that is inclusive, where people can acknowledge their own mistakes and grow from them, you're going to have a culture and an organization that is much more innovative than one that doesn't, right? So your language determines that. And then your embodiment. So how are you showing up as a leader? A lot of people come to me saying that they want to work on their leadership presence, right? What does that mean? It means, how are you feeling and how do other people perceive you when you walk into a room, right? How are you living your leadership in your own body? How are you showing up, right? So, what that means is, are you standing tall? Not boastfully, right? Not necessarily chin in the air, but are you standing tall? Do you believe what you're saying? Can you feel that? Usually when you can believe what you're saying, you're speaking from your belly rather than your chest or your throat. You know, are you grounded? A lot of times I find that leaders who tend to lose their temper a lot, or who are maybe a little uh, out of balance emotionally, or are not able to regulate themselves emotionally, are not grounded. So what I mean by that is that they're living in their head, right? I often say to my clients that you don't want to walk around like a talking head. You want to remember that you have this whole vessel that you're walking around in. And so before you walk into a meeting, can you feel your feet on the floor? Can you recognize, maybe put your hand on your belly, remember that you're a whole human being? Because the thing is that our bodies are present. When you're in your body, you can be present because your body will only tell you what's here and now, because your body is constantly looking for threat, right? So your body is here and now, and it can tell you you're safe, you're okay right now in this moment. Whereas your mind only has your previous experiences to go off of. And so your mind is constantly feeding you with, you better watch out for this and you better watch out for that. And what if this happens? And what if that happens? And oh, last time you did this, this is what happened. So there's so much chatter happening in your mind. So from an embodiment perspective, if you can stay in your body, then you're going to be much more present. You're going to be much more balanced. You're going to be much more grounded. And you're going to come across as a much more stable leader, right? And the other piece of that is when you're grounded and you show up that way, other people around you are going to feel that same sense of grounded calmness and confidence. And that's what you want in your people. And so it's really about, recognizing how I'm showing up is impacting other people, recognizing that the job of a leader is to build other leaders. It's not to, constantly keep them under you, and empowering people to show up at their best.
That's brilliant, and I love especially like the body, how it really helps in our regulation, right? Because there's so much chatter, and let alone social media and so on and so forth. And if you don't really have check and balances in that setting, for yourself, it becomes really hard. How does the heart play into this whole equation? So,
Yeah.
what's your take on the heart and in terms of embodiment, but also your body, your mind? How does it somehow play in?
That's a great question. So I would say, again, it's about choice. I mean, for me, heart is where compassion lives, heart is where desire lives, right? And I think a lot of times, um, we, especially as women, tend to fault ourselves for having desire, right? Because as soon as a woman expresses desire, then usually it's, oh, you're too needy, or really, why do you need so much, you know? But I think when we can learn to honor our own hearts and recognize that there's nothing wrong with desire, and I think attachment is another thing. I don't think they're the same thing. But when we can recognize that there's nothing wrong with desire, everyone has it. We can have compassion for ourselves and others. Then we can learn to honor our heart as well. And when I think of embodiment, to me, heart is a part of that, right? So when we're truly in our bodies, and grounded, I think compassion is much easier to feel. Empathy is much easier to feel when we are grounded and fully embodied.
Beautiful. I also want to congratulate and thank you for being a mother. I think it's probably the most important job of that you can actually take on. How has your motherhood really changed your life, your outlook in terms also of the meaning of life and your purpose? Just walk us a little bit through how it is like and how important it might be or not for you to be today in the place that you are, which is highly outstandingly successful and really sharing your experience so boldly with the world.
For me, it changed everything. So my son is my oldest. When I had my son, I felt a huge responsibility to make sure that he can show up in the world as someone who is, again, grounded. He's able to give back to society and live a fulfilling life, right? And so I had to look at myself, because I also know that children, they rarely listen to what we say, but they're really watching what we do, right? So I had to really look at myself. And I think children are one of the biggest mirrors of who we are, because at least for me, when I had children, like all of my sort of patterns and tendencies came out, right? When I looked at him, like, why are you doing this? And why are you doing that? And I mean, I had to really look at myself. Um, And my son was very, very active in many ways. And, the way that I was raised, probably, in those younger days, I wanted to see him sit down and be a calm child. And he wasn't that, and I'm grateful that he wasn't, because he taught me a lot in terms of who I needed to be. And then when I got pregnant with my daughter, um, I was pregnant with my daughter when I realized that I needed to separate myself from this community. And I really attribute a lot of that to being pregnant with her, because I'm like, I'm bringing a daughter into the world. How can I bring a girl into the world when I'm allowing all of this to happen to me? There's no way, because I wouldn't want that for her. Right. And so I had to look at, who did I want her to be? Who did I want my son to be? And if I want my daughter and my son to show up in that way, then who do I need to be as a mother to create that, to help them develop into that? Right. And again, I don't want to say that I get to direct that, because I do believe that our children come through us. They're not of us. But I do think we influence, who they become, the choices that they make, how they show up in the world. And so when I saw all of that, I realized I had to get really comfortable with uncomfortable conversations, because I needed to talk to them about everything. I didn't want anything to be off the table. So that was one. I needed to show up as I wanted to be. I had to start watching myself really carefully. When I got in an argument, children are so innocent. So when we have, um, at least this is my perspective, when there's a clash between me and my children, I always have to look at myself and say, okay, what's really going on here? What's my underlying intention? What am I trying to have happen here? Because chances are their intention or their purpose or their mindset is much purer than mine is, because they're younger. And so I have to question that, right? And it might be a little misguided. It's not that I don't provide them guidance, but we do so with a lot of conversation, a lot of compassion, recognizing that whatever they're feeling is reasonable. The reason they might be feeling it, they might be misattributing that, but they're feeling things for a reason. So it's just been a lot of acceptance, a lot of slowing down to really see what's happening. I think in the pace of life that we're living today, it can be hard to do that. But a lot of slowing down, a lot of watching myself, a lot of watching my relationship with them, recognizing that my relationship with them is the most important thing and is the most important teacher. And in that way, it's really shaped me as a person, as a leader, as a coach, as all of those things, as an author as well.
Can you unpack, please, what you mean? I think I get your idea, but I'm just curious what you mean that they come through us, not they're not of us, but
Mhm.
they really come through us. Unpack this, because I think that's very deep what you were just alluding to.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not the first person to say that. So what I mean is that, our children, and this is probably more of a spiritual perspective that I hold, they are their own being that come into this world with their own purpose, their own agenda, whatever it is, right? Um, as parents, I view us as just the vessel through which they come into the world. That's it. They're not here to fulfill our desires, our wishes, our dreams, our ambitions. That's not what they're here for. They have their own set of those. And so I think it's our job to prepare them for their own ambition, for their own purpose. It's our job to prepare them to be able to look at the world and be discerning, to make sure that whatever path they're choosing or whatever path they're walking down, they're being conscious of it and they're choosing it intentionally and they're having an intentional existence. And so, yeah, I would say that's how I view parenting.
That's really beautiful. So, what you're basically saying is that your notion of us is really not being a body with a soul, but rather uh, an embodied soul, right?
Yeah.
So that is really powerful, and I want to dive a little bit into also religion, because obviously what you have been through, right? And the potential resentments it can actually cause, right?
Yeah.
But still, I see that you kept this open mind of, and that's also to some extent, I think, what Hinduism especially provides is it really was probably the vessel of science emerging in the first place because it's very open ended, right? Everything basically is possible.
Yeah.
So, can you elaborate on that a little bit more? How your relationship is today, given your experience, what you have been through in terms of religion?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, for a while, I really distanced myself from the religion, from the culture. And I think Hinduism, there's a little bit of a debate whether it's actually a religion or a philosophy. And so I definitely distanced myself. But I think when you look at a religion or a philosophy, whatever you want to call it, there's the religion and the philosophy itself, and then there's the interpretations of it. And then there's the way that people are living it, in the world. And I don't necessarily consider myself a Hindu per se. And the reason for that is because I don't really appreciate the way that it's being embodied and practiced in the world. And so if I were to say that I'm a Hindu, then it's very likely that you sort of get clumped into a body of people rather than a specific religion, because most people don't know the ins and outs and the nuances of the religion. And so I don't necessarily call myself a Hindu. There are many beliefs within Hinduism that I subscribe to, right? Whether it's ahimsa, which is non harm, whether it's, this idea of being an embodied soul, whether it's the idea of reincarnation. There's many of those things that I definitely uh, believe, but I don't necessarily consider myself a Hindu. I've always been a seeker of the divine, always. I think the difference today is that, and this is also a very Hindu belief, right? Is that the divine that I seek is within myself. And that is a very Hindu belief. However, the way that I experienced it as a child was to look for it externally in others, right? Like this idea of a guru. They're the ones who are going to take you to God. There's an old Sufi quote that I have in my book that says, "Guru and God are standing side by side." And so, the follower has this question: who do I bow down to first? And so the Sufi says, well, of course you bow to your guru first, because the guru is the one who takes you to God. So you can imagine the brainwashing in that, right? Um, and so there's a lot of those kinds of things that I don't subscribe to. And I think they can be really, really harmful, especially in this day and age of power. And so I think it's important to challenge, to question things, to recognize that there's many, many interpretations of the same teachings, and that you can choose, right? And so even with my own children, um, we talk about some of the things within Hinduism, but at the end of the day, I teach them that the divinity that you're seeking is within yourself. And you have to learn how to sort of separate that out from your negative patterns, from, impulses and all of that, so you can really find that voice of divinity within you.
Beautiful. I just, to wrap this conversation up, I just want to ask you, what do you think might the book be able to contribute to a human being by reading it? What do you think is it that will help the person in one way or another? What is kind of the biggest thing that you personally wish that it somehow helps a person in one way or another to accomplish?
So it's my hope that, because throughout the book, throughout my experiences, what I've done is sort of given voice to the words that I never said out loud. And so my hope is that as people read this book, they will look at themselves and say, why am I not asking this out loud? why am I not questioning this out loud? Why am I just accepting this? So that people can start to get a sense like you can trust yourself. And the other piece of it, like trust yourselves and trust your body. Because again, the time when I started to recognize like I can trust myself is when I started the physical practice of yoga. Because then my body was talking so loud I couldn't ignore it anymore. Right? So just really recognizing like those questions, those voices are already inside of you. You just have to give them voice.
Beautiful. Second last question, just quickly going back a little bit to your children, because that's a concern that I think that everyone really shares, is that how do you raise children in an age where they are exposed basically constantly to new social media? How
Yeah.
do you navigate that?
You know, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, for me, it's constant conversations. It's making sure that, because it's so easy to say, okay, no, you can't have this, you can't have that. And I'll be honest, I don't allow my kids to have social media. So there are certain boundaries that I put down, but really having the conversation as to why, and staying in conversation and recognizing sometimes your children are going to be mad at you. Like my kids aren't always happy with me. Um, so I think it's important to have those boundaries, also have conversations, also remind them. Like, just last night, my son was texting somebody, but it was late. It was like 10:30. I was like, "Who are you texting?" My son's 16 years old, right? So he got really annoyed at me, like, "Mom, why are you asking me that?" And so I said, I made him come sit down with me on the couch, and I said, I know sometimes it seems like I'm just trying to be nosy or get into your privacy, and I'm not, right? But as your mom, like you're growing up, you're 16 years old, you're getting older way too quickly for my taste. And sometimes I just want to be included in your life. Sometimes I feel like I'm losing you too quickly. Right. So it's like that balance of right and wrong and relationship. Like how do you and it's hard because we're parents, we're not their friends. But at the end of the day, reminding them in a way that they will understand that there's love here, there's genuine concern. That's all I have. I mean, we'll see in 20 years how these kids turn out. I have no idea. I don't want to claim to know any answers. I mean, what we're dealing with in this age of social media and screens and the internet is new. So I think we're all sort of navigating it the best we can.
Thank you so much for sharing this. Lastly, what makes you truly feel alive?
My children, my children. We are very silly in our household. We dance around the living room and you know, imitate each other and knock each other over at times. And when I'm with them, I feel the most alive. I feel like I'm able to be the most myself that I can be. Um, yeah, yeah.
Chanchal Garg, thank you so much for being really a blessing to myself and really to the world.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Yanik. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Chanchal Garg. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.